Well, good afternoon. Good afternoon. Welcome to MAGLabs. My name is Corey Olson. I am known online as the Tolkien Professor. I've been running a podcast of that name for 9 years now. And I've been getting flack from all of my academic colleagues for naming my podcast that. It's not the podcast they mind, it's the definite article they give me flack about. You're like, seriously, you're the Tolkien Professor? And I'm like, it was a good URL. That's kind of why I chose it. I wasn't trying to suggest I'm the only one, but it's been a lot of fun. What I do is basically I do an academic podcast. Academic podcast. What does that even mean? My whole thing is wanting to sort of take Tolkien especially, which is my focal point. Take it seriously, to sort of give Tolkien the sort of careful academic read that, he deserves and so often doesn't get in mainstream academia. And it's been really fun. I started doing it as a way essentially as a kind of alternative actually to traditional publication. My department chair way back when was like, you really need to publish in some scholarly journals. And I was like, okay. But what would be more fun? What would be more fun is doing a podcast and actually engaging with lots and lots of people out there who really want to talk about this. And it was, the response that I got was very, very encouraging. Well, the response I got from the populace was very encouraging. The response I got from my department chair was less encouraging, but that's okay. It was fine. So that's sort of how I started, and I've done a bunch of different things since then. But today, what I wanted to start off here at MAGLabs talking about is, in general, why fantasy matters. I think that this is something that a lot of people don't really think about enough. There's been some change, I think, in how, sort of geek culture is viewed in our society. There's a little bit more acceptance, I think, of geek culture now than there was, say, 10 years ago, which is encouraging. But I don't think it's understood anymore. I think it's tolerated more because our culture as a whole is sort of shifting more towards tolerating other people who are different than you, and not tolerating people who are different than you is increasingly stigmatized. So I think that honestly seems to me what is mostly behind sort of the comparative acceptance of sort of fantasy and geek culture, not an actual understanding or respect for fantasy and geek culture exactly. And I don't need to, I'm sure, sort of explain to anybody here what are sort of the things that, external culture, our mainstream culture thinks and says about fantasy literature especially, and particularly grown adults who spend their time, engaged with fantasy things. Apart from other unkind words that people might say, there's one primary indictment of fantasy. It has been the same for 100 years, 150 years, and that it's just escapist, right? Fantasy is escapist. Why would you do that? There's sometimes explicitly, sometimes only implicitly, the idea that it's childish. Are you ever going to grow up? Right, and start thinking about grown-up things, even in your recreation time, right? The books you read, the movies you like. There's something sort of juvenile, according to our mainstream society, in liking fantasy stuff. But of course, it goes a little further than that, right? It's not just kind of innocently childish. If you continue to indulge in this sort of childish thing, it's irresponsible, right? You need to face the real world. You're kind of avoiding the real world. You're avoiding, your responsibility to engage in the real world by engaging in fantasy worlds instead, in playing pretend and make-believe all the time. And there's even potentially the implication that it's kind of cowardly, right? You can't face the real world, and so you're running away from it, right? You're building this little fantasy world refuge that you retreat into instead of engaging with the real world in any kind of constructive way. So that's kind of the indictment, right? That's been out there for a really, really long time. Now, of course, if we look at this in a historical context, it's kind of interesting, right? On the one hand, this kind of stigma has been around for a while. You know, I've been saying 100, 150 years. It goes back further than that, but not that far, actually, when you look at the big picture. All the way back through, say, the 18th century, there have been people who have been saying this kind of thing and speaking very much against the sort of the literature of the marvelous. You can read, for instance, one of my, I am in general a fan of Dr. Samuel Johnson, the great 18th century the dude who wrote the dictionary. I mean, he's fun most of the time, but he wrote this essay that I quite hate about the marvelous in literature and why it's terrible and why you should never ever indulge in reading fantasy literature. He was like the sort of talking head of that point of view back in the mid-1700s. So this goes back a while, but if we go back further, we find not only that there is not this kind of condemnation of the marvelous and the fantastic, but people would have found that absolutely bizarre. The idea that, you know, that fantasy, that imagined worlds and magic and things are like not fit entertainment for adults. I mean, tell Shakespeare that, right? How puzzling would that have been? Tell any medieval author that, you know, whose favorite stories are all things like, you know, the Aeneid, right? And the story of the fall of Troy and all the medieval romances and marvels. You know, tell the author of Beowulf that. It would have been, you know, to every society practically prior to the Enlightenment, it would have been very, very strange to think that anyone would, I mean, what else do you tell stories about, right? Telling stories, you tell stories about marvelous things. You know, if you give sort of an outline of the sort of typical modern novel, right? I'm going to tell a story about a person who's not really very interesting or special. In fact, he's kind of just like everybody else. And throughout the story, what he does is like the normal stuff that you do every day, right? He like goes to work at exactly your kind of job and has conversations with other people who are not really special or interesting at all. And that's the story, that's like the premise of my book. And they would be like, why would anyone waste their time on that kind of story, right? That is, like, we all live that every day, right? You tell stories in order to think about them. Like you tell stories because somebody did something extraordinary, right? There's something extra. If it's not extraordinary, why bother telling a story about it? Now, interestingly, the sort of modern mainstream society who looks down on fantasy will also look down on that. I mean, so if you try to tell them, like, dude, you know that we're weird, right? That our society is strange for condemning these things. There's this interesting kind of extension, right? Just as within our society, you know, it's fantasy is for kids, right? So too, they'll sort of talk about these ancient societies as if they were themselves immature or childish, right? Oh yeah, well that was when, you know, human society was in its you know, adolescence, right? We've grown up since the modern world is like now the like mature adult version of human society. And it's like, I can't even think of anything more arrogant than that. I mean, it is so absurd, especially as somebody, I mean, I was you know, trained as a medievalist. Medieval literature is what I taught, in addition to Tolkien, at colleges for years. The idea, I mean, anybody who really knows those periods, to think that the luminous geniuses who were writing in the Middle Ages were like, you know, just hadn't really kind of matured enough to get to the modern novel yet is absolutely insane. But the reality, of course, is that I think, you know, the medievals and the ancients, that they kind of realized some things that modern people don't. That modern people are, well, not exactly taking for granted, but not thinking about, I think, in ways that they should. Fantasy is not only okay, like it's not only all right to kind of come out of the closet and admit that you like fantastic things, but there are actual virtues to it. It's actually important and really beneficial, not only for us as individuals, but as a society. There's an active virtue to it. But let me pause for a second because I need to define. So I've been using the word fantasy, right? But I want to explain the way in which I'm using the word fantasy. Very often, when we talk about fantasy, we use it as a very specific genre, right? Like the imaginative stories with magic in them. That's fantasy, right? As differentiated from science fiction very often. Certainly if you go into bookstores, this is what you find, right? There's the fantasy section and the science fiction section. When I'm talking about fantasy, I'm not using the bookstore genre term in that way. I'm speaking of it a little bit more broadly. In my mind, for instance, science fiction and fantasy are very much together in the same, are all part of the same picture that I'm talking about here. It's about what we call it, Signum University, my institution, imaginative literature. That is, stories that don't just describe the real world as we see it, right? Any kind of, if you are playing with our world, however that is, right? Are you writing within an alternate universe? Are you imagining a world in which magic happens in various ways? Are you imagining what things might be like on a remote planet? Are you imagining what our planet might look like in the future? Are you imagining what our planet was actually like in the past? Are you telling stories in a galaxy far, far away? There's lots of options, right? And all of that stuff I am putting under the category, generally, of fantasy. Is there a question in the back?
Yeah, I just wanted to double check. So we're talking also like magical realism, things like that, where it's more like if there's any tweak, you're not sticking to like normal rules of gravitation and the rest of it, like or like even changing the way people are perceiving things like folk tales, that counts as imaginative work?
Yes. I would count any of that stuff. Yeah, actually, magical realism is a fun category. Magical realism is the genre that I call fantasy literature for people who don't want to admit they're reading fantasy literature.
No, I've had that with people where they're like,
Yeah.
oh, well, there's this. I'm like, it's basically you're writing fantasy.
It's fantasy. Yeah, exactly. You just don't want to be put on that bookshelf. Right, in the bookstore. So no, exactly. I mean, and especially, I mean, I could tell from an academic point of view. Oh my goodness! Like you say, you want to like teach a course in magical realism, and everyone's like, oh yes, that is a pillar of 20th century literature. You say, I want to do a story on like Tolkien and his influence on modern fantasy, and they're like, oh, that is not real literature. No, that is fantasy. Yeah, that's all. But yes, exactly as you defined it. If you are tweaking the world, if you're telling a story that tweaks the world, that's in its most general term the kind of thing that I'm talking about. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah. No, that's great. Yeah.
I was curious what you said earlier on, kind of what many of us grew up with, kind of this general condemnation of whatever non-realist.
Yes.
Kind of fantasy. Is that a Western, European, Western world thing, or is that more globally?
I'm not sure. I'd be really interested in that, actually, to sort of see because of course, when you look at much of the literature, non-Western literature, much of it has fantastic elements.
And that was my question, like in some of my studies in like Asian culture, it's very, or even I do a lot of work in India, and it's very, even in common society, it's common in conversation to talk about magical crystals and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I've not really studied this, so I can't say with much specificity. But I also have never gotten the sense that there's the same kind of. I don't think that, like many Eastern cultures, have sort of worked themselves into the particular sort of mental kink that our society has with regard to fantasy, and in particular the kind of aversion that they have, that so many people have for it. The idea that it's, as I say, irresponsible or even cowardly to think about it or indulge in it. So the way I'm using fantasy, just to actually talk briefly about sort of where that word came from, because it's a medieval thing, which means it's fun. So fantasy was actually a psychological term in the Middle Ages. And your fantasy, by the way, the part of your brain that does fantasy, you probably don't know this because a lot of modern people have strange misconceptions about how the brain works. In the Middle Ages, we know things differently, right? So the fantasy is in the front of your brain, Okay, this is the part of your brain that does fantasy. Your memory is in the back. Your head is oriented in time, by the way. You're facing forward in time. So fantasy, you're thinking about the future. You're using the front of your brain. If you're making decisions about what's happening now, that's in the middle of your brain, and your memory is in the back of your head. Trust me, again, don't believe anything that scientists tell you. What do they know? This is the medieval model of the brain, and it's awesome. Okay? By the way, that's where the expression off the top of your head comes from, out of your fantasy, which is in the top or the front of your brain. Okay. Anyway, so your fantasy, there is a larger psychological category called imagination, and what imagination is very simply the capacity to conjure up images of things in your head. Okay, not to invent stuff. Just so, like, if you are able to picture something that you're not actually seeing with your eyes at the time, you're using imagination, right? So, of course, obviously, we use this all the time in lots and lots of ways, right? Fantasy is a subset of imagination. Fantasy is conjuring up the image of something you have never seen before, possibly something no one has ever seen before, right? Okay, so in this sense, this is where the idea of the fantastic came from. Right? The fantastic is something, an idea, an image that is conjured up that no one has ever actually seen. Right? So this is what, like, when they use the word fantastic to describe things like fantastic creatures, right? Like a hippogriff is a fantastic creature because no one has ever actually seen one. It's just been imagined by someone. It's been produced by someone's fantasy. So anyway, it's that difference, right? It's that fundamental difference, again, in the back, going back to that very broad definition of fantasy, right? Anytime someone is telling a story or sort of engaging in ways with our world which no one has ever seen, right? You're kind of bending what's there. Why do this? What's good about it? I've claimed that there are virtues to it. I want to go back to the accusations for a second, and here I want to come to some of the things that Tolkien talked about this. He did a lot of thinking about these things, and he was unsurprisingly, a major defender of fantasy, and specifically fantasy for adults. He started off, of course, his first publication was The Hobbit, not his first thing he wrote, but his first publication was The Hobbit. And so his first sort of public step was, in a sense, kind of playing along, right? Fantasy is for kids. And he was kind of doing there's a sense, and I'm not dissing The Hobbit here, but in a sense, The Hobbit was kind of following the party line, right? And then in The Lord of the Rings, he does things differently. And it's like, no. This book is for grown-ups, right? And I want to explain why it's not only okay, but good for grown-ups to read this kind of thing. So he thought a lot about these common, which again were the same things that were being said back, when he was writing and when he was, growing up and beginning his career 100 years ago. So let's take the question of escapism, right? It's always the adjective, right? It's escapist, that is still always used. And Tolkien's challenge here, he said, okay, can we think about this for a second? Think about that word you're using, escapist. Escape. He's like, under what circumstances is the word escape bad or shameful? Like, why is it that you're using that word scornfully? He's like, seriously, think for a second. Is there any other context in which the word escape is bad? If you need to escape from something, right? Escape is good. It's always good, right? It's sometimes heroic, in fact. He was saying, there's only one group of people who speak of escape with scorn. You know who they are? Prison warders. That's who speaks of escape with scorn. Nobody else. Only those who imprison people speak of escape with scorn. Everybody else who has been in a situation from which they feel they need to escape, nobody speaks of escape with scorn. So why should this be? And in what sense are we escaping? Tolkien's response to the escapist thing is not to deny it, right? But to embrace it and say, no, yes, exactly. It's an escape. But again, please explain to me why that's bad. He said people seem to be confusing escape with desertion, right? As if you're deserting, you're failing, you're backing out on your responsibility. He's like, but that's not at all implicit in the idea of escape, right? So what are you escaping from? We'll come back to that in a second. As far as the childishness is concerned, right, and the childhood stuff, the association between fantasy and childhood, he said, that's not even true. He starts off by debunking the idea that fantasy is, it's not just a question of should fantasy be just for kids, right? The idea that fantasy should be for kids at all. He's like, well, some kids like fantasy, that's true, but so do some adults, right? Fantasy is not a natural kid thing. Not all kids like fantasy, right? So he asks the historical question, when was it? When was it that fantasy begins to be associated with childhood in particular? Answer, when it became unpopular with adults, right? And they didn't throw it away. They didn't ban it. They just sent it to the nursery, right? And the metaphor he uses is a really great one. He's like, it's like in an old Victorian house, you put all the beat up furniture you don't want anymore in the nursery, right? Because you don't care if the kids mess it up, right? It's not because you think the kids are going to particularly like that furniture. It's because you don't want it in the parlor anymore, right? But at the same time, you don't want to throw it away either, right? Because it's still maybe good for something, right? So you put it in the nursery. And he's like, that's what happened to fairy tales. That's what happened to fantasy, right? It became, so this idea of it's good for kids is, he argues a kind of almost sort of subconscious commendation, right? Our society doesn't want to just ban it, but at the same time, they want to distance it from the adult experience. But anyway, embracing escape. What exactly are we escaping from? Now, Tolkien's essay on fairy stories it was originally given as a talk. He gave it as a lecture. And it's a hugely important work for trying to understand Tolkien. He defines a lot of vocabulary and talking about what fantasy is and what he's trying to do. It's primarily about fairy tales, of course, which is the sort of bigger category definition at that term. The concept of fantasy literature didn't really exist at that time. A lot of the definitions really came out of that essay. But the essay itself is a little uneven. That is, Tolkien rambles a lot in that essay, and parts of it are really hard to follow. And actually, this section where he's talking about escape is one of the worst in the entire essay. He launches into these apparently irrelevant rants. And he gets like super Tolkien ranty. And when Tolkien starts ranting, he starts sounding like a really cranky Oxford Don, right? Who is like, modern technology and get off my lawn, right? It's like, oh, traffic and, tourist places, and he hates all these things. But my question is, why is he doing it? Why does he go on these rants when he's talking about escape, right? Why, when he starts saying escape is okay, we need to escape, why does that thought lead him to ranting about public bathing places, which he does, right? And like modern train stations and things. Again, you can read this essay, and I mean, again, I love Tolkien, and I love this essay. Had this essay been produced in one of my English classes, I would have been like, okay, we need to do some revision here, right? We're kind of losing the thread in this moment. But again, but why? Why does he launch onto those rants? And the answer is Tolkien was very concerned about the directions of modern society. I think it's fascinating that he starts talking, when he talks about escape, he starts talking about the dangers, even the evils of the modern world, right? He talks about industrialization and manufacture and how, things are not made by individual craftsmen anymore, but we get prefab, mass-produced, garbage, which is almost always ugly and usually bad. And more importantly, he starts talking about how the engines of war are more persistently driving the industrialization cycle, and how more and more we're just, more and more of modern technology is tending towards the development of bigger and bigger weapons, right? So what does this have to do with escape? What does this have to do with fantasy literature, right? Now, Tolkien doesn't actually come back around and explain that very explicitly in this essay. So part of what I am wanting to do in the rest of this talk is give some of my thoughts on what he was getting at and why he was ranting there in that place. That's a little side footnote on the rest of my talk. But the point is that the world around us, this world from which we are escaping, imaginatively, when we are reading a fantasy story, writing a fantasy story, playing a fantasy game, right? This world around us is not always good. It's not even mostly good, it seems, on many days, right? And Tolkien, at least, believed that it was trending distinctly downhill, right? And it's not hard to see why he thought that. So again, in what sense, then, does fantasy provide not desertion from, but escape from that world, from the world around us? And I think there are two senses that I would identify that I think are really important. Sense one is that it frees the mind, is a purely intellectual and imaginative escape, right? Again, in other words, this is not a refutation of the accusation that people make about people who like fantasy, right? You're just trying to escape from the real world. Yes, I am. That's it. And that's useful, and that's very, very valuable. Again, when Tolkien talked about escape, he said, if you're in prison and you can't physically escape from if you can't get out of your cell, maybe you would at least want to think and talk about something other than your cell, right? Again, this is him very elliptically describing modern literature as basically just talking about the bars and the cinder blocks of the cell that you're living in, right? That would be a little harsh. Fair in some cases, but anyway, it's okay. Not only is it okay, it's good if you're a prisoner, right? To refresh your mind with memories and thoughts, even imaginations of the world outside your prison, right? You can keep your sanity that way. It's easy to become too acclimated to our world. And here I'm not just thinking in kind of Tolkien's get off my lawn senses about, the way the whole world is going to the dogs, even the good parts of the world. Right? Tolkien talked a lot about this in a different part of his essay. There are wonderful things in our world, right? Think about the things that you have seen in the world around you that made you stop and gasp the first time you saw them, right? But you don't do that anymore the third time you see them, the 10th time you see them, the 100th time you see them, right? All of the wonder goes out of the world with familiarization, right? One of the things that fantasy does, as Tolkien argues, is it refreshes your perspective on this. By not just thinking about the world around you all the time, you can cease to take for granted many of the things that are good about the world and that you have learned to take for granted. And I certainly think that Tolkien's own work has done this for me in a lot of ways. Like, to cite one example, I know that I look at trees totally differently after reading The Lord of the Rings, right? Having been introduced to Treebeard, I just can't. Oh man, I had this. So in the house I lived in before the one I live in now, there was this tree in the backyard. And the people who built the house, it had been really dumb. Like, they planted this tree almost smack up against the house, which might have looked cute when it was a sapling when they planted it. But by the time, by this time it was like 20 years old, this tree, and it was like completely looming over the back of the house, and it was really bad. So my wife is like, that tree has to go. And oh man, I'm like, we have to kill it? We're just gonna go out back and murder that tree? You know? And I'm like, seriously, it was hard. I'm like, I feel so bad about, I mean, we planted something else there instead and everything, but I'm like, do we have to hold a funeral for the tree? I mean, I would never have thought about trees that way, right? I mean, I look at landscaping in an entirely different way. Maybe you would perhaps think that this is not an upgrade in how you look at landscaping, but still, like by meeting Treebeard and the Ents, by thinking about this imagined world, I know that that's not real, right? Trees don't really talk and don't really move, and yet, having had that imaginative experience, it has made me much more aware of the life of trees as living creatures. And that in fact, trees, there isn't anyone who's really on the side of trees, as Treebeard complains, right? And so that sort of need is something that really kind of grew in me in this way. The kind of escape that fantasy offers is able to sort of nourish our creative impulses as well, right? Not just to take the world as it is, impulses that would otherwise just atrophy, right? Even if you're creative, right? Even if you're writing stories and things. Again, if the work that you write is always rigidly realistic, right? You're still just operating within the one little circle, right? If you only ever write what you know, right? Write about what you've experienced. That's very common advice to writers, right? Write what you know. But if you take that really literally, right? If you just write about your real world experience and the real world that surrounds you, how are you ever going to learn anything, right? How are you going to expand yourself at all? And if you can't expand yourself at all, how are you going to expand anybody else, right, through what you write? So there are several ways. So in these ways, which again are sort of purely, psychological, but this kind of escape has a real effect. It really does enable you to escape. It really can change your world in the sense of changing the way you interact with the world, the way that you see the world. But of course, it can also change the world in a more literal sense. There is the sense of actual escape as well. That is to escape not only mentally, but even in action. So are there ways in which your world is like a prison? Change it. Escape from it, right? By which I don't mean run away, right? Put your head in the sand, but rather the opposite of that. Changing the world around you, changing the things that make the world feel like a prison to you, the first step is not accepting it, right? Not just sitting back and saying, I'm okay with these bars and this cell that surrounds me, right? You have to work out first what the world could look like, right? You have to fantasize, you have to imagine it first, how it would work. This is how you become a kind of visionary who can really create change, who can, disrupt industries and break social conventions, right? You have to be willing to think outside the box. Everybody who does things like that are, by definition, they're people who are not content with the world as it is, right? Who won't just subscribe to that, won't just reconcile themselves to it. And imagining real change in the world around us is not really that different from fantasy. And I can kind of sort of speak to this myself in my own experience. I said at the beginning that I've been podcasting for 9 years. How many of you have heard my podcast? Anybody? No? Awesome. Great. The Tolkien Professor is my podcast. So since I started the Tolkien Professor podcast 9 years ago, I have, and it's one of those things, maybe you've had this experience in your life where you look back and you're like, I have a hard time piecing together how I got to where I am now, right? Like every step along the way kind of made sense at the time, but when you look back, you're kind of like, this is insane. So I started off by starting a Tolkien podcast, and I have ended up founding a university, which is weird. By the way, just a little advice that I would give myself 7 years ago. Starting a university from scratch, more work than you probably think. It's turned out. It's turned out, yeah. So it started with people in my podcast who were really engaged and really active, and they wanted more. They wanted more live interaction, and so I started experimenting with all kinds of different things, and I did this online class, this sort of full interactive live discussion thing, which was called the Silmarillion Seminar. We went through the Silmarillion chapter by chapter. Tolkien's Silmarillion. It was like the Silmarillion class and support group for people who had never been able to get through the Silmarillion before, which is lots of people. If you've ever tried to read Tolkien's Silmarillion and not gotten through it, it's okay. It's absolutely okay. And we have services that are here for you to help with that. So anyway, that was the idea of the Silmarillion seminar, and I absolutely fell in love with it. Not only the Silmarillion, which I did fall in love with the Silmarillion again, but with this whole interface. So I ended up, there were people who were just clamoring to take classes, to take new classes, and so I was like, okay, hey, let's start an online institution where we do that. Let's do a Tolkien studies program. Hey, let's start a master's degree program. Wouldn't that be fun? And then, yeah, so now I'm president of Signum University, which is a startup from scratch university. But see, here's the thing. When I started, having gone there, right? Having said, hey, let's do classes. Hey, let's have a degree program. Wouldn't that be fun? I'd been a professor. I was a tenured professor at the time, and there were a lot of things. Higher education had been for a while feeling like a prison, right? Not to me. I mean, I'm not trying to say I was this genius who was held back by the structure. It wasn't about that. It was mostly about my students. What I was an English professor at a small private school, and I would have those talks with my senior English majors who are graduating with $80,000 worth of debt, and an English major, right? A BA in English, and going out to work in public libraries or as elementary school teachers and stuff. And I'm just oh gosh, I mean, I'm from a poor background. I've never really understood the whole being rich thing, and so, it's just heartbreaking to me to see. And then, of course, lots of other minor ways too. Lots of other minor frustrations about some minor, some less minor, about how higher education works. Of course, there's the student debt issue, which is a huge issue, right? But there's also faculty. Boy, is it unpleasant being a faculty member in modern academia, and the way that faculty are increasingly exploited, and the way that tenure track positions are being given. That teaching load is given increasingly to graduate students, so that there are fewer places where people can get hired with a PhD, while also, by the way, producing more PhDs because they've got to let graduate students in to be able to teach them. So you have more and more people competing for fewer and fewer jobs. Awful. It's just a terrible, terrible world in some ways. So again, I'm looking around at higher education and saying, yeah, this feels like a prison, right? How can we do this differently? So since I was doing it anyway, since I had decided I wanted to start this course, this master's degree course, I said, well, we're doing this from scratch, right? There's nobody to tell me I can't do this yet. So let's invent it, right? Let's think outside the regular frame. Let's imagine what a totally digitally native 21st century higher education would look like. How could we treat faculty differently? How can we treat students differently? How can we organize the entire business and pedagogical structure so that we can charge people very little, right? And yet treat faculty and staff with dignity and pay them like they deserve, and all those kinds of things. And it's been really fun. And you know what it has been mostly? You know what life skill has helped me more in the process of founding and developing Signum University? DMing Dungeons and Dragons campaigns. Oh man, and all the time that I spent doing homebrew rule sets for my D&D campaigns and stuff, I actually self-consciously use the same font that I always used for my D&D rule sets when I'm working on rules and policies and things like that for our university, because the creative process is exactly the same, right? I'm inventing a new world, right? It's inspired by something else, right? It's based on our world, but it's a totally different world, right? And we've been working on making it, and there have been a bunch of people that have come along with me and have been such a huge part of making Signum University happen. We've been 7 years now. We've been going. We just we just passed our comprehensive review with the state of New Hampshire. We have Department of Education approval of our program as of a month ago, which is really exciting. And it's so funny because you look at all the state laws, and they don't even imagine that something like we're doing is even possible. Like, there is no rules that even acknowledge the possibility of starting up a university from scratch with no money, which is what we did. We're completely crowdfunded. We started the review process, and we looked at the fee schedule, and we were like, whew, okay, it's going to cost us $25,000 to be reviewed by the state. Okay, so we crowdfunded it. We're like, we don't. This might seem like small change, to most universities, but this is not to us. So we raised it, and our students and supporters, we raised the money in like a week and a half. It was fantastic. Now we're raising money to support our application for accreditation, which we're in the middle of now. It's a crazy thing, but again, this is how, and I have often reflected on this throughout this process. Like, how did I get here? How did I end up doing this? How have I ended up, Signum University is now this little pilot program, right? This little island of, here's what higher education could look like, right? Here's what a 21st century university, like a real 21st century university, like one born in the 21st century, not like an 18th century university that is trying to use 21st century, trying sometimes, to varying extents trying to use 21st century techniques. Here's what it could look like. And if you start it from scratch without all of these older assumptions, how you can build a system that works differently and provides an awesome learning environment for people and good pay for faculty and all this kind of thing. We're doing it. We're making the dream happen. But again, it all starts with, this is the same exact impulse. Again, I never, ever would have done this. And I remember this, and it's really interesting to me. When I started my podcast 2 years before I started Signum. And when I first started my podcast, there was this subset of faculty members, of my colleagues, who were not supportive of my podcast, right? Who thought it very frivolous and very foolish, and used to tease me about it and stuff. Well, they teased me good-naturedly until I published my Hobbit book. That is like until a book contract came out of it. Then they stopped teasing me good-naturedly. But it's academia. But those same people who just did not get the whole Tolkien podcast thing are the same exact people who were most resistant to Signum. And I'm like, hey, I've got this, this is fantastic. This is how higher education should be. This is totally the future of higher education, and it's absolutely doable. In fact, not only could we as an institution do it, but I could do this out of my house. Right? This was like the talk that I had with the president of the college that I was at the time. He was not interested. So I'm like, fine, I'll do it out of my house. But anyway, those people they couldn't see it. They wouldn't see it, right? That's not how things are done, right? That's not how we do things. This is not going to work, right? And again, I think that those things are very similar. Like, the people who are most resistant to fantasy are the people who need it most, right? Who need to be refreshed, who need to look outside the world that they, normally inhabit, and who need to really understand the value of the kind of exercise, the kind of mental and imaginative exercise that fantasy in all of its different forms gives. So Tolkien argues fantasy, far from being for children, is a fundamental human impulse, right? We are sub-creators. That was his word, Tolkien's word for it. We are sub-creators by nature, he says. The impulse is stronger in some than others, right? It can be ground out of you, right, that impulse, if you let it be. But the accusations against fantasy and people who like fantasy are not only untrue, they're ironically and almost insidiously the reverse of true, in fact, right? I mean, expanding your mind and your imagination, that is something that children do, right? But should adults really stop doing that, right? Is that really okay? Right? Is it more responsible somehow to accept the world around you as it is rather than to imagine a better world? Is that what being responsible looks like to anybody, right? Is daring to envision a better, cooler, more interesting world, right? Is that somehow a cowardly act? How does this make sense? Right? If we are to imagine no new worlds, no alternate universes, right? Where are we going to find the blueprints for improving our world? They're not going to be in our world, right? They can't be. So, I, for one, certainly agree with Tolkien's rather cranky stubbornness in refusing to accept the narrow-minded modern rejection of fantasy, and certainly believe with Tolkien that fantasy is not only acceptable, but wholesome, courageous, and even a necessary part of making a difference in the world. Anyway, so thank you. I'd be happy to take questions, have further discussion. Yeah?
Is there a differentiation, this is my area, between something that, like Star Wars, which is, I consider pure fantasy,
Yeah.
and something like Asimov, where I really consider more like a sociologist, like
Right.
studying how society would be in various...
Well, you can identify sub-genres, right? I mean, like, again, to me, the fundamental, so using the bookstore categories for a second, right? Fantasy and science fiction. To me, the primary difference between fantasy and science fiction is both are asking what-if questions, right? Both of them are based on a fundamental what-if question. What if the world was like this, right? What if this premise, now we tell a story, right? In the broadest, clumsiest, most whitewashing terms, right? The difference between fantasy and science fiction is that science fiction is at least theoretically interested in possible what-ifs, right? What if things proceed in this particular path of technological development anyway? So, like with Asimov's Foundation series, for instance, right? I mean, there you do have a sort of sociological experiment. What if sociology, mathematics, and the other things that go into the whole foundation concept, what if those could be developed to such a point that you could, predict human behavior in these ways? What would that look like, right? And so you can say that that's very different from, what if you could move things with your mind, right? And it is. I mean, I would definitely acknowledge that there's a difference between those two things. But I would say the difference between those two things is less extreme than the difference between both of them and a kind of story which doesn't say a what if at all, essentially. That's why, for me, I'm happy to put even somebody like Asimov or Larry Niven or somebody like that into the same category with Tolkien when talking about this kind of thing in this sort of general way. But yeah, there are certainly always distinctions, and you can see. I mean, I don't know. I myself, I very quickly tire of, like, sometimes, I talk to people who really want to debate things like, is Star Wars fantasy or science fiction? Let's discuss, right? And I'm like, okay, I mean, it's a little bit interesting, but the problem is that I disbelieve in the concept of the hard and fast genre definitions from the beginning, or the people who have that argument, like how many of them even agree on what those terms mean exactly? So I don't indulge in that kind of debate very often. But so I do think there's a difference. But again, both of them are asking what if, right? Sort of establishing those premises which are different. So yeah.
So I was finding something really interesting. You mentioned the Enlightenment as sort of the period where, fantasy started getting kind of the short end of the stick. And I was, so I've been delving into a lot of folk tales recently for a podcast called Myths and Legends.
Mhm.
And along with reliving all of my love of Lord Dunsany,
Oh yeah. Lord Dunsany. Boy, that guy could come up with a title for a story, couldn't he? I don't think anyone has ever titled stories better than Lord Dunsany. Holy cow.
Like there's some of you're just thinking like, what reasons? Okay, it's about a city that loses its mind.
Oh, it's so good. Anyway, sorry, go ahead.
Something about the Enlightenment, though, the Enlightenment is really where you had sort of, instead of mythology and a lot of sort of magic being part of the normal day-to-day life, you had this automatic separation. I'm wondering, could you probably make an argument the Enlightenment is the reason fantasy got short of the stick is they were trying to make a divorcement of science from magic. Like that's where
Yeah.
the divide happens.
Right. Right. Whereas science and magic were two sides of the same coin in the 16th century. Yeah.
With folktales, you would have like fairies and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Like odd happenings, and people would think it maybe like over the top, but they wouldn't disbelieve it. Well, when you got to the 18th, it was sort of like, no, you don't believe in these kind of things. So then fantasy became kind of grouped in with that. It's like we're trying to find out what's real, but then by defining what's real, they sort of make it almost.
Yeah. Now keep in mind that almost everything I'm about to say, I'm saying as an amateur. I'm not claiming this to be true, but my general opinion of this kind of thing, yes, I do think that notice the fact that evaluative question is being asked. Is it true or not? Right?
Yeah.
That's the difference, I think. Right now I'm in the middle of a long, probably too long, discussion of Sir Thomas Malory's Le Morte d'Arthur in one of the things that I'm doing. Google the Mythgard Academy, and you can join in my free public chapter-by-chapter discussions of, well, in so much as it has chapters, which it doesn't. But anyway, bit-by-bit discussions of Sir Thomas Malory. We just finished class 8, and we're like a sixth of the way through the book. We meet weekly on Wednesday nights, and you can see him on YouTube. But the point is, we were just having this discussion in the Malory class. And one of the things that people were asking was, did they really believe that this stuff happened? Right? Like, did they believe that? But really the question, that wasn't really the question they were asking. They didn't ask that question the same way that we asked that question. And I think you're right. That goes back to that sort of Renaissance moment, right? And this is one of the things, now here my Tolkien and Lewis bias is going to come out, because both of them were thought about these things very similarly in these ways, and saying, the thing that happened, like the roots of modern science are exactly this. Like C.S. Lewis's metaphor for this was really great. He says science and magic were twins. They were born twins. One twin thrived, and the other one was sickly and died young. But both of them were born at the same time of the same impulse. And that impulse was, how can we better control our environment, right? It was about power, humanity asserting power over the world. So magic, and when I say magic, I mean like Faust, right? Conjuring demons and that sort of thing. This is why we're obsessed with demons in the Renaissance. People weren't obsessed with demons in the Middle Ages. I mean, they were figures in stories, but you didn't have witches in the Middle. Witches aren't a big thing in the Middle Ages. In the Renaissance that witches become a big thing, right? So this whole, like, I want to traffic with demons in order to gain power like Faust did, right? It might, to a modern person, it might sound strange or merely slanderous to say that was the same impulse that drove the early scientists. But it's exactly the same impulse that drove the early scientists.
Same thing with Mary Shelley's Frankenstein.
Yes.
The idea of gaining power or dominion over life.
Yes.
In that case, all men did that.
Absolutely. So yeah, But this is why you see, if what you want to do is you want to accomplish stuff, right? So you've got magic as one possible way to accomplish stuff and science as another way to accomplish stuff. Well, they quickly found that one of those two things worked and the other one didn't work, right? That's why magic died out in that way, because it didn't work, right? I mean, you couldn't in fact get control of your environment that way. I mean, I think if you read Faust and other things, you might say, mercifully, magic didn't work. That would be an interesting and horrifying what-if story to tell, right? What if it did? Right? What if magic had been, in fact, just as effective as science in helping people establish dominion over the world around them? Then what might have happened, right? And what would the modern world look like? But it wasn't. But again, that's where they really start asking that question, what's real, what works? And that's why, because their interests were very practical, right? Yes. It didn't pan out. Yeah. Yes. Yes. Yeah. Myth is powerful. Myth is important, but it's not going to give you power in the here and now in the practical way that scientific development and technological development turned out to do. Right. So yeah, I do think that that's the root of it. So when we do get to the Enlightenment and we see people talking about, focusing only on that, which again going back to that Samuel Johnson essay that I was talking about from the Rambler. It was an early Rambler one too, one of the first 10 maybe, I think. I don't remember the number of it, but anyway, he's like focus on like what is true, what is real, right? And this is it becomes a really big deal. So yeah, I do think that's kind of where it started back a long time ago. When people started caring about those practical outcomes and wanting to see that. Yeah. Awesome. Other questions? Thoughts? Yeah.
I have two questions.
Sure.
One is that, I know you talked a lot about escapism.
Yeah.
And I see how that applies. Could one argue that you can escape from this world but still process? I mean, a lot of it, you're into processing
Yes.
history or the human condition or
Yes.
psychology in a lot of these fantasy stories. Like
Yes.
Harry Potter books, there's a lot of allegory in there, and Lord of the Rings as well.
Yes.
And Star Wars, right? There's always like a hero's journey. So I think it's interesting that people are so many little schools make excuse for that.
Yeah, it's
I think there's a lot to process.
exactly.
Reading that, you're escaping from this world.
Completely. It is very puzzling to me how when people will say things like, well, why are you reading, like it doesn't relate to the real world? And it's like, but it relates to the real world in exactly the same way, at the very least, right? At minimum, it relates in exactly the same way that any other book relates to the real world. I mean, you can make that argument against fiction as a whole, right? If it didn't really happen, then it's not relevant to our world. Well, of course it is, for exactly those reasons, right? It's important to think through stories, right, and to hear stories, and to, as you say, thinking about the human condition, thinking of all the different psychological, sociological, spiritual, all sorts of things, right, that get kind of worked through in stories, and which you can learn from by reading stories. Even if everything else, right, is taken away, that's still true of fantasy, right? Fantasy doesn't do less than a realistic novel. It always does more. Like it does all the things that a realistic novel does, but it also does other things as well. So yeah, the idea that definitely.
And then kind of on that note, on the note of sort of it being a child's thing versus
Yes.
an adult thing, I'm wondering if maybe that's why, now that you kind of got me thinking, maybe that's why more modern fantasy novels have a place in the real world versus like you have sort of a lot of TV series.
Yes.
And like, Twilight, which I'm not like, but yeah,
Sure.
Twilight and Harry Potter.
Yeah.
They're in a real
Yes.
context. They're in the UK or in
Right.
Seattle
Right.
versus just a made-up world. And
Yeah.
I wonder if that was kind of, maybe that's something that writers caught on to and kind of were like, okay, well, I want to make this accessible by making it in the real world, but still
Right.
adding fantasy elements.
Yeah, I mean, there are kind of two things there, right? I mean, I do think that some of the modern series that do like urban fantasy and things like that are often, I don't know, they feel a little bit like compromises in that way, right? Like, okay, I'm not gonna like make up a whole new world with a map in the front, right? And you start reading, because whenever you're reading a new sort of pure fantasy or high fantasy work in that way, there's a cost of entry, right? I mean, you've got to be willing, when you read the first page of any great fantasy novel, you've got to be ready, like, okay, where am I? I don't know, right? Not just who are these people, which is always true in any novel, right? But what is this place? How do things work? What's going on? I haven't the faintest idea, right? Whereas it's so much easier and more comfortable, right? You know, you start a novel with somebody's first day of 9th grade, you know where you are, right? Okay, I mean, all they have to tell you is it's in Northern California. Okay, all right, I know where I am now, right? Or at least I think I do. I've never really lived in Northern California, so probably I don't actually. But anyway, right? Yeah. So whereas you start something like The Wizard of Earthsea, right? And you're like, okay, what are these islands? What's the archipelago? What is that animal? What kind of plant is that? I don't know anything about anything here, right? Like it takes me 50, 100 pages to become acclimated to this world that I'm living in. So I do think that there are ways in which modern fantasy writers often will sort of compromise in that way. One of my personal favorites in this sort of modern fantasy genre are Jim Butcher's Dresden Files books. I love the Dresden Files. It's a urban fantasy mystery, essentially. And it's about a wizard who lives in Chicago. And so it's a sort of alternate universe. It's sort of like Harry Potter in one sense, in that it is in the modern world, which is the same as our real modern world, except of course it turns out that there's this like magical world that has been all along, and most people don't know about it, very much like Harry Potter in that way. So I do think in some ways like that, it's a way that fantasy writers a compromise makes it sound like they're wimping out, and I don't want to appear to be slighting that kind of work, because I don't. I really like it. But there is a way in which you can kind of make things a little bit easier in that way.
Yeah. I'm just wondering if they wanted to make it more accessible.
Yeah, perhaps. I mean, I certainly do think it is easier in that way. It is easier to invest. But of course, there's also a way in which, and thinking specifically about Harry Potter here, it's part of the original fairy tale idea, right? I mean, in On Fairy Stories, Tolkien says fairy tales are not stories, fairy stories are not stories about fairies. They're stories about mortals who encounter fairies, right? But it's about the mortals, right? A fairy tale is about, the girl who goes off into the forest and ends up, encountering a witch or a fairy or somebody like that. It's not a story about the witch. Right? It's not a story about the fairy. Rumpelstiltskin isn't about Rumpelstiltskin, right? It's about, the girl who is trying to get away from Rumpelstiltskin, essentially, right? So in that sense, you can see something like Harry Potter, for instance, is very much following, certainly following in, for instance, like the Chronicles of Narnia footsteps, right? Starting in the frame of our world, right? And, C.S. Lewis writing 10 years after World War II about kids who are sent away from London during the Blitz, and while they were away from London, here's what happened to them at the country home that they went to. That's a frame which would have been as familiar to, readers in England in the 1950s as, imagine you were a peasant going to collect wood in the forest was to, 19th century Germans, So in that sense, she is very explicitly, it starts at the Dursleys, right, in an aggressively mundane world, right? The world of the Dursleys is extremely aggressively mundane. And then the world of, not only does he enter into this, the platform 9 3/4, like the wardrobe, right, being the gateway through which he goes into the magical world, but also, of course, the really sort of fun thing, about Harry Potter is the way that that world pursues him, right? Starts to enter into his world and disrupt the Dursleys' world, leading, of course, to the hideous disruption out on the shack on the island, and as they are under siege, literally, and that, at least they certainly feel it to be a literal siege by the magical world. So that kind of play between the mundane world and a magical world that's a very traditional concept in fairy story and fantasy. So I think that a lot of the modern writers are also, like J.K. Rowling certainly, are kind of playing with those kinds of interactions as well as kind of compromising for the sake of acclimating modern readers, I think, as well. But I think, are we out of time? Yeah, that's what I thought. Okay, but we are out of time. So thank you for coming. If, by the way, as president of Signum University, I can't forbear to say, if you're interested in learning more about Signum University, you can have a Signum bookmark. I have awesome Signum bookmarks that you can put in your favorite books, or little flyers about our programs. Both are master's degree, but we have a lot of free programs. Every week I do hours and hours every week of free public education programs. It's one of the main things that we do. So if you don't know about what Signum University and the Mythgard Institute do, you should totally learn, because we do really, really fun stuff, both in gaming. I'm representing my Lord of the Rings Online affiliation as well. I've been doing a lot of work with them because they're awesome. So anyway, I want to encourage you. So I have information if you want it. Thanks, everybody, for coming.